The Great Depression split economic thought into two irreconcilable camps. While John Maynard Keynes proclaimed that markets fail and governments must intervene, I stood firm on a different truth. The very interventions Keynes championed were the source of our economic troubles. This wasn't merely an academic disagreement, it was a fundamental clash over the nature of knowledge itself. Can brilliant minds in government offices truly grasp the dispersed information that millions of individuals possess? Keynes believed they could. I knew they couldn't. Our debate shaped the next century of economic policy, determining whether societies would trust spontaneous order or central planning. The stakes were nothing less than human prosperity and freedom. Today, as governments worldwide embrace unprecedented intervention, understanding this intellectual battle becomes more urgent than ever. The very essence of how we coordinate human action hangs in the balance. Chapter 1: The Knowledge Problem That Keynes Ignored. My disagreement with Keynes began with a fundamental insight he simply couldn't grasp: the impossibility of any single mind, no matter how brilliant, possessing the knowledge necessary to manage an entire economy. During our exchanges in the 1930s, Keynes displayed what I came to recognize as the fatal conceit of intellectual elites, the belief that because they could analyze aggregates on paper, they could manipulate them in reality. Keynes saw unemployment as a simple technical problem, insufficient aggregate demand requiring government stimulus. But this perspective revealed his profound misunderstanding of how markets actually function. Employment isn't created by demand alone, it emerges from the complex coordination of countless individual plans, each based on local knowledge that no central authority can possibly possess. When I observed the Austrian economy during World War I, I witnessed firsthand how central planning disrupted the delicate web of market relationships. The war economy planners, despite access to vast statistical machinery, could never replicate the informational efficiency of free prices. They substituted their limited knowledge for the distributed wisdom of millions of market participants, with predictably disastrous results. Keynes treated the economy as a machine that could be fine-tuned by adjusting fiscal and monetary levers. This mechanistic view ignored the reality that economic order emerges from human action, not human design. Every employment decision reflects specific local circumstances: the entrepreneur who knows her customers' preferences, the worker who understands his own skills and aspirations, the investor who perceives opportunities others miss. This dispersed knowledge cannot be aggregated into the statistical constructs that Keynes manipulated. The tragedy of Keynesian thinking lies not in its mathematical sophistication, but in its fundamental epistemological error. By treating human knowledge as if it could be centralized and coordinated by experts, Keynes laid the intellectual foundation for the systematic suppression of the discovery processes that actually create prosperity. His theories gave governments permission to override the spontaneous coordination mechanisms that had evolved over centuries to solve the knowledge problem. Chapter 2: Why Spontaneous Order Beats Central Planning. While Keynes advocated for deliberate government intervention to manage economic cycles, I recognized that such intervention inevitably disrupted the spontaneous order that naturally emerges from voluntary exchange. The fundamental distinction between emerged order and imposed order became the crux of our disagreement. Spontaneous order, what the Greeks called cosmos, arises without central direction when individuals follow simple rules and pursue their own purposes. Markets, language, and common law all exemplify this phenomenon. No one designed the English language, yet it enables precise communication among millions. Similarly, no central authority designed the market system, yet it coordinates the economic activities of billions across the globe. Keynes confused this organic order with the imposed order, taxes, that governments create through direct commands. He believed that because governments could plan specific outcomes, they could improve upon the unplanned coordination of markets. This revealed his failure to understand that the complexity of spontaneous order far exceeds what any designing mind can comprehend or replicate. During our London School of Economics debates, I repeatedly emphasized that market prices communicate information that no planning board could possibly gather. When the price of copper rises, it signals scarcity to every user worldwide, encouraging conservation and substitution without any central coordinator needing to understand the millions of individual circumstances involved. Keynes saw only the price level, I saw the information network. The superiority of spontaneous order lies in its adaptive capacity. When circumstances change, markets adjust through millions of individual responses to local conditions. Central planners, constrained by their limited knowledge and bureaucratic procedures, cannot match this flexibility. They respond to yesterday's problems with today's policies, while markets continuously discover tomorrow's opportunities. Keynes's faith in fiscal fine-tuning assumed that governments could identify optimal intervention points and time their actions perfectly. But this requires knowledge of dynamic relationships that are constantly evolving as participants learn and adapt. The spontaneous order of markets embodies this learning process. Central planning interrupts it. The irony of Keynesian intervention is that it destroys the very coordination mechanisms needed to achieve Keynes's stated goals. By overriding price signals and market feedbacks, government stimulus creates distortions that must eventually be corrected, often through the very recessions that intervention was supposed to prevent. Spontaneous order, while sometimes appearing chaotic, generates the stable patterns of coordination that central planning can never achieve. Chapter 3: The Price System versus Government Planning. The heart of my dispute with Keynes centered on the function of prices as carriers of information versus his view of them as mere variables to be manipulated by policy. This difference in understanding prices revealed the fundamental epistemological chasm between our approaches to economic coordination. In my 1945 paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society, I demonstrated that the price system performs a function that no amount of statistical data gathering could replicate. Prices don't just reflect supply and demand, they communicate dispersed knowledge about resource availability, technological possibilities, and consumer preferences across time and space. When the price of oil rises, it instantly signals every user to economize, every producer to increase output, and every inventor to develop alternatives, all without central coordination. Keynes treated prices as impediments to optimal resource allocation that required government correction. He saw price flexibility as causing problems rather than solving them. In his view, sticky wages and prices prevented markets from clearing, necessitating fiscal intervention to boost aggregate demand. But this analysis missed the informational content of price signals entirely. Observe how markets respond to unexpected scarcity. When a hurricane threatens oil refineries, prices rise immediately, long before any government agency could assess the situation and coordinate a response. This price increase serves as a discovery mechanism, revealing information about relative urgency that no central planner could possess. Consumers automatically reduce consumption, alternative suppliers increase production, and substitutes become more attractive, all through the spontaneous coordination of individual responses to price signals. Government price controls and demand management interrupt this discovery process. When authorities suppress price increases during shortages, they eliminate the signals that would otherwise coordinate conservation and increased production. The knowledge embedded in market prices disappears, replaced by the limited understanding of bureaucratic planners. Keynes's advocacy for activist fiscal policy assumed that governments could improve upon market coordination by managing aggregate demand. But this approach treats prices as mere accounting entries rather than information carriers. By manipulating demand through spending and monetary policy, governments distort the price signals that guide resource allocation, creating artificial scarcities and surpluses that the price system would naturally prevent. The tragedy of Keynesian price theory is that it surrenders the market's greatest advantage, its capacity to discover and communicate knowledge that no single mind could possess. In place of this distributed intelligence, Keynes offered the concentrated ignorance of central planning, dressed in the mathematical sophistication that made it appear scientific to policymakers eager for intellectual justification of their interventions. Chapter 4: The Fatal Conceit of Economic Engineering. Keynes embodied what I later termed the fatal conceit, the belief that human intelligence could design economic systems superior to those that emerge spontaneously from voluntary cooperation. This intellectual arrogance, however well-intentioned, led to policy prescriptions that systematically undermined the conditions necessary for prosperity. The appeal of Keynesian economics to policymakers was obvious. It promised that intelligent intervention could smooth business cycles and maintain full employment. This message resonated with political leaders who naturally wanted to believe they could control economic outcomes. Keynes provided the intellectual framework for activism that politicians craved, wrapping government intervention in scientific respectability. But the scientific pretense of Keynesian macroeconomics masked a fundamental methodological error. Keynes borrowed the methods of natural science and applied them to phenomena that required different analytical approaches. In physics, controlled experiments can isolate variables and test hypotheses. In economics, we deal with complex adaptive systems where human learning constantly changes the relationships we seek to understand. This scientism, the inappropriate application of natural science methods to social phenomena, led Keynes to treat economic relationships as stable and predictable. His equations assumed that the relationships between consumption, investment, and employment would remain constant across different institutional contexts. But these relationships depend on human expectations and institutional frameworks that themselves evolve in response to policy changes. My experience with the Austrian war economy revealed how quickly economic relationships break down under central planning. Relationships that held under market conditions disappeared when prices were controlled and resources allocated by decree. The economic equations that described market behavior became meaningless under planning, yet the planners continued to rely on statistical relationships derived from market economies. Keynes's confidence in fiscal fine-tuning reflected his failure to appreciate the adaptive nature of human behavior. When governments systematically intervene in response to economic conditions, people learn to anticipate these interventions and adjust their behavior accordingly. The relationships that Keynesian models assume to be stable become unstable precisely because of the policies based on those models. The deeper problem with Keynesian engineering is that it substitutes the limited knowledge of policymakers for the distributed intelligence of markets. Even if government officials possessed perfect information about current conditions, which they don't, they cannot predict how their interventions will affect the evolving network of human relationships that constitute the economy. The fatal conceit lies in believing that human reason can improve upon processes that embody more knowledge than any single mind could comprehend. Chapter 5: How Institutions Evolve versus How Keynes Wanted to Design Them. My fundamental disagreement with Keynes extended beyond economic theory to the very nature of institutional development. While I recognize that effective institutions emerge through evolutionary processes of trial and error, Keynes believed that intelligent design could create superior institutional arrangements to manage economic problems. Throughout human history, our most effective institutions, property rights, contract law, monetary systems, and market mechanisms, developed spontaneously through countless generations of experimentation. No single mind designed the common law system, yet it evolved sophisticated mechanisms for resolving disputes and protecting individual rights. Similarly, market institutions emerged without central planning, yet they coordinate the activities of billions of people across the globe. This institutional evolution operates through a process of cultural selection where practices that enhance cooperation and coordination tend to survive and spread, while those that hinder human flourishing gradually disappear. The institutions we inherit from this evolutionary process embody wisdom accumulated over centuries of human experience, wisdom that far exceeds what any contemporary designer could possess. Keynes approached institutional design with the confidence of an engineer building a machine. He believed that intelligent analysis could identify optimal institutional arrangements and that government power could implement these designs. His advocacy for discretionary fiscal policy assumed that economic institutions could be redesigned to eliminate business cycles and maintain full employment. But institutional design faces the same knowledge problem that plagues economic planning. The designer cannot possibly anticipate all the circumstances that the institution will encounter or predict how people will respond to the incentives it creates. Institutions that appear optimal in theory often generate unintended consequences when implemented in the complex reality of human society. Observe how monetary institutions have evolved. The gold standard emerged spontaneously as markets selected stable media of exchange. Central banking developed later as governments sought to manage monetary systems. But these designed institutions have proven far less stable than the spontaneous monetary arrangements they replaced. Contemporary cryptocurrency experiments represent a return to evolutionary institutional development, allowing markets to discover new forms of money without government design. The tension between evolutionary and designed institutions appears clearly in Keynes's advocacy for international economic coordination. He championed institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank as solutions to global economic instability. These designed institutions, however, lack the adaptive mechanisms that allow evolutionary institutions to respond to changing circumstances. Effective institutions must be compatible with the dispersed knowledge and diverse preferences of the people they serve. Evolutionary processes naturally select for such compatibility because institutions that conflict with human nature simply fail to survive. Designed institutions, however brilliant their conception, cannot incorporate the knowledge embedded in evolutionary processes and therefore tend to create the very problems they were designed to solve. Chapter 6: Individual Liberty versus Collective Management. The Hayek-Keynes debate ultimately centered on competing visions of human freedom and social organization. While Keynes advocated collective management of economic affairs through enlightened government intervention, I insisted that individual liberty provided both the moral foundation and practical mechanism for human prosperity. Keynes viewed individual economic choices as potentially harmful to collective welfare. In his framework, the paradox of thrift meant that rational individual saving could harm the economy during recessions, justifying government override of private decisions. This logic extended to investment, consumption, and employment decisions, all potentially subject to collective management if they conflicted with macroeconomic objectives. This collectivist approach fundamentally misunderstood the relationship between individual freedom and social coordination. Individual liberty isn't merely a political preference, it's the prerequisite for the spontaneous order that makes complex societies possible. When individuals are free to use their local knowledge and pursue their own purposes within general rules, their separate actions coordinate automatically through market mechanisms. The protection of individual choice spheres allows for experimentation and discovery that no central authority could orchestrate. Entrepreneurs discover new ways to serve consumers, workers find employment that matches their skills and preferences, and savers direct capital toward its most productive uses. This decentralized discovery process depends absolutely on individual freedom to act on personal knowledge and bear the consequences of those actions. Keynes's advocacy for demand management required systematic interference with individual economic decisions. Fiscal policy works by redirecting resources from private to public use, while monetary policy manipulates interest rates to influence private investment and consumption choices. These interventions substitute collective judgment for individual decision-making, disrupting the feedback mechanisms that coordinate voluntary cooperation. The constitutional framework that protects individual liberty also protects the spontaneous order that emerges from individual choice. Property rights, contract enforcement, and the rule of law create stable expectations that enable long-term planning and investment. When governments possess discretionary power to override individual decisions for macroeconomic purposes, they undermine the institutional foundation of market coordination. My experience observing authoritarian systems convinced me that economic and political freedom are inseparable. Countries that suppress individual economic choice inevitably suppress political dissent, because economic planning requires political control to be effective. Keynes's technocratic approach assumed that economic management could remain neutral and scientific, but the power to manage the economy inevitably becomes the power to control society. The irony of Keynesian collective management is that it defeats its own humanitarian objectives. By suppressing individual choice and disrupting market coordination, it reduces the prosperity that makes collective welfare possible. Societies prosper not through collective management, but through the liberation of individual creativity and energy within stable institutional frameworks that protect everyone's freedom to pursue their own vision of the good life. Chapter 7: Modern Applications, From Bitcoin to Pandemic Policy. Today's economic challenges illuminate the enduring relevance of the Hayek-Keynes debate. From cryptocurrency development to pandemic response policies, we continue to witness the fundamental choice between spontaneous order and central planning that defined our intellectual disagreement. Bitcoin represents perhaps the most elegant vindication of my institutional evolution theory. No government designed this monetary system. It emerged through voluntary adoption as people discovered its advantages over traditional currencies. The decentralized blockchain protocol embodies the same principles of spontaneous order that govern market systems, coordinating global transactions without central authority. The cryptocurrency ecosystem demonstrates how institutions evolved to solve coordination problems that central planning cannot address. Different digital currencies experiment with various technical approaches, allowing market selection to identify the most effective solutions. This evolutionary process mirrors the spontaneous development of monetary institutions throughout history, but accelerated through digital technology. Contemporary central banking policy reflects the persistent influence of Keynesian thinking. The Federal Reserve's quantitative easing programs and zero-interest rate policies assume that monetary authorities can fine-tune economic performance through aggregate demand management. But these interventions create the same informational distortions I warned against during our original debates. Artificially low interest rates prevent the price system from accurately signaling the relative scarcity of capital, leading to systematic misallocation of investment resources. The boom-bust cycles that result from this monetary intervention validate my business cycle theory, which Keynes dismissed as outdated Austrian doctrine. The COVID-19 pandemic response revealed how quickly governments embrace central planning during crises. Lockdown policies assumed that central authorities could determine optimal social and economic arrangements better than voluntary coordination could achieve. But these policies ignored the dispersed knowledge that individuals possess about their own circumstances, health risks, and productive capacities. Market-based responses to pandemic challenges consistently outperformed government planning. Private companies rapidly developed vaccines, testing systems, and protective equipment through voluntary cooperation and profit incentives. Meanwhile, government agencies struggled with bureaucratic procedures and political constraints that prevented effective resource allocation. Digital platforms like Amazon, Uber, and food delivery services demonstrated spontaneous order's adaptive capacity during lockdowns. These systems automatically adjusted to changing demand patterns and supply constraints without central coordination, providing essential services when government systems failed. Modern debates about healthcare, education, and environmental policy continue to reflect the Hayek-Keynes divide. Progressive politicians advocate for comprehensive government management of these sectors, while market advocates emphasize the superior coordination capacity of voluntary exchange and competition. The knowledge problem remains as relevant today as it was during our 1930s debates. Government officials making policy decisions about complex technologies like artificial intelligence or genetic engineering face the same informational limitations that plagued earlier central planners. The dispersed knowledge necessary for optimal resource allocation cannot be centralized, regardless of computational advances. Understanding this fundamental limitation of human knowledge remains essential for designing policies that enhance rather than hinder human prosperity and freedom. Conclusion. The Hayek-Keynes debate transcends economics. It reflects humanity's choice between trusting emergent wisdom or imposed control. While Keynes offered policymakers the appealing illusion of economic mastery, I insisted on epistemic humility before the complexity of social coordination. History has vindicated the spontaneous order approach. Soviet planning failed precisely as my knowledge theory predicted, while market economies adapted and prospered through decentralized discovery. Today's digital economy proves that voluntary cooperation can solve coordination problems beyond any planner's imagination. Yet Keynesian thinking persists in policy circles, reflecting the eternal appeal of the fatal conceit. As you observe contemporary economic challenges, remember that prosperity emerges not from brilliant central design, but from protecting the conditions that allow spontaneous order to flourish. The choice between freedom and planning remains ours to make, with consequences that will echo through generations.